Okay, well, hey everyone, my name is Hannah Hobbs, and this is my podcast called Hello with Hannah. Thank you for tuning in today, and I am super excited because the special guest that I have on the show today is someone who I'm so excited for you guys to meet. Aziza Green is a writer. She writes for Eternity News, and she's also a researcher who I've recently discovered is on track to begin your PhD in digital wisdom. We're going to have to unpack that in a second, but I love the sound of it. And she's a wife and mother, and interestingly enough, also happens to be somebody I went to high school with. So, Aziza, hi. So good to see you. Thanks for being here. How are you today?
So good. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for having me on your podcast and your video cast, I guess.
Yeah, video cast, podcast, pod video. Let's just roll with it. All of the things. But I guess, to give a bit of context to anyone tuning in, the hope and heart behind these conversations is basically just to inspire creative people. Whether you're a writer in, the musical sense, or whether you love to write stories, whether you're a copywriter, whether you're just someone who's interested in learning how to craft narratives that are inspiring to people. And so I'm super excited to talk with Aziza today. Before we get into the questions, can you just quickly unpack this digital wisdom PhD thing? Because I feel like people want to know what we're talking about here.
Yep, cool. So I am, as well as all those things, I'm also an online campus pastor at my local church. And so very involved and have been involved on all things on the internet and just sort of awareness of and participation in digital culture. So all the social media stuff, all that sort of stuff. And so I wanted to essentially interview and survey pastors and ministers, as well as sort of lay people, congregations, about how they engage with digital culture, digital media, and essentially try to understand what kind of digital literacies we need, both as ministers and as everyday Christians, to engage with digital media. How do we read things online? How do we critically understand and think about what we read online? How do we steward our attention? What kind of spiritual practices, Christian contemplative practices we need to strengthen those areas? And so, I'm going to be interviewing, surveying a whole bunch of pastors and people.
Cool.
Hearing the experience.
It's so amazing. I'm really intrigued. I look forward to seeing all of this unfold and learning more along the way, but I think that's super cool. Okay, so hopefully we have some creative people listening in today. And I guess if we could zone in on one topic today, my thought was just to talk about storytelling. And for you, like I mentioned before, you're a writer, you interview people for Eternity News. So I guess storytelling is a huge part of what you've kind of devoted your work life to. Can you talk a little bit to, one of the things I hear a lot of young writers talk about is how do you decide what is the narrative of this story? So as a songwriter, often it's can you simply just answer, what is this song about? Is it easy to figure that out, or is it confusing? I mean, as a writer and an interviewer, how do you stay on theme and on track with your story?
Yeah. Okay. So I think, in my sort of context where I'm interviewing people, I guess before I go into an interview, I'm reading as much as I can about the person. I'm reading what they've written, what's been written about them. And so that sort of generally will give you a context for who you're interviewing and what they might want to talk about. If I'm not sure, I'll usually lead with questions like, what is particularly interesting to you at the moment, or kind of try to draw that out. And then I guess everyone's different in this sense in my kind of industry. Some people go in and have a very clear angle, and some stories are like that, like they've written a book about grief, or they've written a book about how to, hear from the Holy Spirit or something like that. And so, yes, Christian media is my context, but
sure,
you could kind of extend it to media more generally. But if it's like a particular book or something or a topic that this person is known for, then that kind of makes it easy to, lead in that direction. But I guess the interviews that I've been doing, I try to have questions that are going to sort of provoke a conversation, and then kind of hand it over to them to lead that conversation, pulling in the reins where I need to, that kind of thing. And I guess as I'm interviewing people, this is my experience, is based on the conversation, I'll kind of start to have a sense of, okay, this feels good, or this feels hot, or this feels like they're in a flow. And I try to follow that because, you know, I think the thing with writing and all forms of creativity, there's kind of like that inspiration moment where it kind of comes out. And then the real work is the editing process, which is where you're starting to look at, okay, big picture, what are we talking about here? And so when it comes to the writing and the editing of it, I guess I try to find those nuggets, or the you know, the the heat signatures.
Yes, I like it.
And then once you have those, I think it's just a process of culling whatever doesn't sort of work in that. It takes practice. It's a discipline, because you have to have restraint, because usually in a conversation, there's so many really interesting and juicy things that they talk about. And especially if people are telling personal stories, you know, sometimes I end up with like 50 quotes, and I'm like, well, this is going to be a really long article. And, you know, the average person can read for about 10 minutes before they need to go on Instagram or something, or TikTok. So yeah, you kind of, it's one part following what feels hot. So it's part instinct, I think, which you develop over time. Other people, yeah, you know, talking to my colleagues and stuff about this, some people just have a really clear idea of, like, I know my boss writes a headline and then she knows that's what it's going to be about, and then everything fits into that. I have one colleague who needs to go for a walk before it kind of comes together. So, and I think we all kind of have that, like it all kind of, you know, is around here. And
yes.
And I would say going for a walk is a really good thing to do in general when you're doing creative things. It kind of gives you a break. It stimulates a different part of, I don't know, your brain. And it just kind of glues everything together. I don't know, you know.
Yeah. I love that. I love that idea of like heat signatures, or like following what's hot. And I can totally resonate with that idea that like your instinct, like as a writer, is something that grows and develops over time. Like something that maybe 10 years ago took me hours to refine and figure out and get to a point where it felt hot. It felt like it was something. Yeah. And now I feel like I can identify that way sooner. And I guess that's just kind of committing to that sense of like internal gut feel, you could call it, or intuition, learning how to pick up on that and then lean in hard to that.
Yeah. And trust it. Trust that you know what you're doing. The other thing, you know, talking about heat signatures and what's hot, I did a lot of writing workshops. I studied at UTS. I did a master's in writing, just super handy degree to have, really useful degrees. That's kind of one of my hobbies. And I had this one lecturer who used this really visual kind of language when she talked about writing stories, and she would say, you know, we'd workshop a story, someone would bring their story, share it, and we'd read it, and then we'd workshop it together in the workshop. Makes sense. And she used to say things like, what's the heart of this story? What's the pulse of this? Like, she just used the most, I loved when she'd talk about these things. She'd say, what's the heartbeat of the story? Or what feels hot in this story? And so I think that's kind of what you're trying to look for when you're writing or, you know, creating something is, what's exciting me? What is, or what's exciting the other person as well, which I think in turn excites you. And, you know, just to share, I interviewed an Anglican academic who's a evangelical church historian. And I was like, I don't have anything in common with this guy. Like, I've never met him before, but I'm writing an article about revival at the moment and the history of revival. And I talked to this guy for an hour, and it was just the richest conversation because he was talking about something he was really passionate about, something he'd studied for a really long time, since the 70s, and when he talked about revival, it just, like, I caught fire. Like, it was hot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
so,
cool.
it, like, in some sense that makes it harder because everything feels so, alive in the conversation. But geez, that's a sweet spot to be in when you're talking to someone and you're both like, you tap into something that they're really passionate about. It makes you come alive. And I think you just have to pay attention to that thing.
It's so good. I love it. And I feel like when something is alive and it has that heartbeat to it, I don't know if this is like a rule of thumb, but it tends to resonate with the masses. Like, it tends to be something that, like you said, perhaps initially you felt like you didn't have a million things in common with this guy, but suddenly everything feels like it's right in line because there's that sense of heartbeat to it. Are you ever like thinking about like how frequently are you thinking about your audience? I think as a songwriter, I'm like, I spent a lot of years writing songs that were a lot to do with my I write worship songs and corporate worship songs, but a lot of my songs for a while there were like how God makes me feel. Like, I feel when I'm in the presence of God, I feel this. When I'm, this is how he's changed me. And then my passion has kind of taken a slight pivot in the last couple of years because I realized just because I feel something doesn't necessarily mean that you feel the same way or that that's how that kind of outworks in your life. I've become passionate about writing songs for the church, like corporate songs that really unify people. But I think it came down to a shift in considering the audience, like considering who was going to kind of embrace the song. For you, are you thinking about your audience and how do you keep it from feeling too insular or too niche and stop it from kind of excluding a broad audience?
Yeah. Look, it's such an interesting question because I think when you're thinking about your audience, like, that's a made up idea, right? Like, that's just a concept that you have. I mean, maybe for you in your context, you have a very specific audience. But for generally speaking, I have a couple of thoughts on this. So one is that, it's actually not a bad thing to have a niche audience in mind initially, especially. I think maybe what you're talking about for the average person would be the difference between journaling and writing for a publication.
Sure.
So, for you, your songwriting is a form of journaling, as a public form of journaling. And in a lot of ways, what you describe when you talk about, writing about the way that God makes you feel, like, that is a pretty universal experience, I would say. There's some kind of hallmarks of who God is and how he kind of connects with us. Obviously, we all have different experiences that we bring to that relationship. But I guess when I think about writing, for me personally, I'm writing for a cross-denominational Christian audience. And so I have to think, but I still have the niche of, we can agree on these, things about God and about Jesus and about some, orthodox doctrine. But, I'm a Pentecostal in a largely evangelical organization writing for a largely evangelical audience. And so I guess I have to keep in like I want to be able to speak from my experience, because when writing for me is a very personal expression, obviously, and that's part of, you know, putting my voice out there. And that's one of the reasons, you know, I was employed there, was because I was bringing a different voice. And so I want to be true to that, but I also don't necessarily want to freak people out, you know,
Sure.
and cause some kind of like storm on the Facebook page or something. Like, you know, maybe in a couple of years when people are used to my voice a bit more, but
You can storm it up then.
yeah, like, you know, let it out. But I just think, yeah, I hope I'm answering the question here, but I'll give it a go. Like, I think, you know, pulling it back again, when you're starting out, I think it's okay to write for a niche audience. I think it's okay to write for, you know, other 25-year-old musicians. That's who are in the Christian music scene. Like, that's a pretty niche audience, and that's good, because that's how you start to, I guess, bring your voice and your culture into, you know, the public forum. But what tends to happen is, as you grow and as you continue to publish and put stuff out there, you may amass, you know, a bit of a more general audience, and then you can kind of translate, you know, some of the stuff that might be Christianese or specific to your subculture to the broader culture. Yeah, but I think initially writing for a niche audience is a good idea. Cool. It actually is a really great way to start. It helps you to refine your voice. It helps you to, I guess, figure out what's important to you and what you want to talk about. And then it's, I don't know, it's just practice and just an instinct. You sort of know what will float and what won't. And if you don't know, you'll test it and find out very quickly.
Yes. Yeah. I really like that thought. It's like, it's not something to be despised necessarily, writing for a niche audience. But I think about, like, you know, different artists that have existed over a long career, and how perhaps, like, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, their kind of target market, maybe, I'm just thinking of this off the top of my head, but say it's a young Disney star, and their market is kind of like young teenagers or young teenage girls. But then if their career has existed for a decade or longer, those girls are now about to hit 30. And so therefore the artist has kind of allowed their work to evolve, and then it's grown up with them. Like, that's an interesting thought as well.
And you cross genres as well. Like, I think, you know, Taylor Swift, T-Swizz.
T-Swizz.
You know, she was country in back in the day, and like, she still writes a lot of stuff about love and relationships. Yeah. But she has a different voice now, and it's just evolved. And I remember, I don't know what year it was, but the year we all became believers. Do you remember that? Like,
sure.
This is this little dweeb, and then, like, bang, like, just all the bops. Like, we just
seriously.
And I don't know, it's just, I guess, an evolution as a creative, and you can't evolve until you just put something out there and then keep looking at it.
It's something I've found myself saying to people over the last few years is, you know, sometimes you have to embrace a bad idea to find your way to a good idea. Do you subscribe to that way of thinking?
My whole thing is, like, terrible first draft. Like, I will just write the worst. Particularly if I'm feeling uninspired, I just will write the worst draft. Like, that will be my assignment for the day, is I'm just going to write the worst version of this story. And then that's draft one. It's done. Sometimes I think the hardest thing is just to get it out. And the thing that, it's that inner critic that is just trying to there's this book called The War of Art. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
Stephen Pressfield, I think it's called.
Okay.
He talks about this idea of resistance, but I don't know if he's a Christian. I have to look into it. But the way he talks about resistance is the way I think about, like, I guess, the enemy, or, you know, just the inner critic. Is every time that his thesis is every time you endeavor to put something into the world or create something, this resistance will come against you, and you should not be surprised about it. This is a part of the creative process. And so, and that's the war, is your role as a creative is to push against the resistance. And it's just, I don't know, I love that kind of language.
Yeah, same.
And I guess the other thing, I've been thinking about lately is I hear a lot of young people, especially young people. We're still young, Hannah, but not that young. The younger folk. I hear a lot of young guys and girls talking about perfectionism, like, oh, I'm a perfectionist. And what I hear in that is I cannot move forward with this thing that I'm working on until I'm 100% sure that this is going to be perfect, beautiful. And it's actually just fear. It's actually just fear of being vulnerable, fear of making mistakes, fear of producing something rubbish. But unfortunately, you're going to have to produce a lot of rubbish stuff before it gets any good. And I don't know, I think especially when you're younger, there's this quote, like a whole paragraph that talks about how, I'll find the guy's name for you.
Please.
But this guy talks about how when you're young and you're starting out, you usually have really great taste. Mm-hmm. And then you have this idea of, this is what I've read, this is what I've listened to. So you have an ear for it, you have an eye for it. That's your first instinct is I know what good is, I know what great is, but your ability is not at the level of your taste. And so when you start out, you're producing stuff that is like so pathetic compared to what you've read and what you've heard. And that can be so discouraging, but like you've got good taste. It's actually a really good thing because you can work your way up to, you don't have to start off there. You can actually start here and just keep shooting, and keep trying and testing. And I've really butchered this poor man's quote.
No.
Perhaps you can put it in the show notes.
Yes, absolutely.
Who it is and what he actually said.
Yeah, I do love that thought, though. It's just like, I think you either like look down on, especially at the beginning of your kind of embarking on this like writing journey, you can either really look down on yourself and just think this work is so subpar, why even continue? Mm-hmm. Or I've also experienced in my immaturity as a younger person, like thinking that the work is better than it is because your taste is so good. Like what you said, you're like, oh, but this is so good. And why can't people see in it what is so obviously there? And
you're welcome, everyone.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank me later. But I think that learning kind of just how to mature and grow and embrace other voices and other perspectives on your work. That's a huge. I've swung the full pendulum of inviting other voices in. So there've been times where no one was allowed in. I might hear people say things, but it didn't actually really get to my heart. It was kind of like, I didn't take it on, basically. And then I've gone hard the other way and invited 1,000,001 people to share what they think. And at the end, I just feel more confused. Mm-hmm. How have you found that kind of balance? Like, do you have a couple of people you would trust and listen to and say, hey, tell me what you think?
Yeah, definitely. I am very open to and invite feedback willingly. Obviously, there's like a trusted circle of people. I think initially, like, I like to get an outsider's perspective, so I lean on my husband's feedback a lot. He just has a really good sense for story, and I mean, he's a teacher and a podcaster, incidentally. So he has a really good sense for story, and I don't know, I just trust his instinct, and I trust his honesty. yeah, I lean on, I guess, my colleagues and my boss for direction and stuff like that. But also, you know, as I said before, I've been in a lot of writing workshops, and so you kind of just learn through that process of, you know, sharing your
Yeah.
creative writing, particularly with 15 to 30 sort of strangers,
Yeah.
and then sitting for about half an hour while everyone just pulls it apart and goes, what does this mean? Or I don't get this, or wow, you sound really XYZ in this, or like identifying you in the story, and you're like,
Yeah.
um, and I don't know, I think you just have to kind of develop a bit of a thick skin to, I think it goes back to that idea of like trusting yourself as well. And sometimes, yeah, people will misunderstand what you've written, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean that their feedback isn't valid, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's good to know when you've lost the train of thought that you had, or your metaphors don't match, or, you know, you've got too much imagery there and it's like, where are we? Yeah, I think that feedback is really helpful. And even if you might not take it on board for that particular project, you might reflect on it later and go, oh, you know, I do tend to do that again and again. And just change it up and just test it out in the next project. So yeah, I think feedback, I think if you can invite feedback, it's always a good idea. But yeah, it does depend on the project. And some things are just more personal than others. And in those, and that's when I think you just need to protect it a little bit more and be willing to receive the feedback, but not necessarily feel like, okay, I have to implement everything that they've said. Especially if you get feedback from someone that you really admire, or someone that whose opinion means a lot to you. You can just sit with it for a while. I think with the creative process, we forget that it just takes a lot of time, you know, and sometimes you just have to mull things over, and and it's okay. Like sometimes, I don't know, my opinion is just to be gracious and to receive it graciously, because you always want to have people that will give you feedback, especially if it's honest. But then, you know, you get to make the call later if it's something that you need to implement, or if that maybe they just didn't understand it, and that's okay.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Like, you know, like sit with it, and I totally love that advice of like receiving it graciously. One of the things I try to encourage people with often is, you know, there are not that many people who are walking around wanting to hand out feedback. Like, so if you actually come across someone who's willing to be truthful with you and speak openly and honestly, and they're the type of voice you want to invite in, like, you've got to invite it in.
Yes.
You've got to say, hey, I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to hear the good and the bad. I want to hear all of your thoughts. Like, in order to get that out of people, you really have to have a soft landing, because I don't know about if you feel the same. I guess it depends on personality type, but I'm certainly not walking around going, who can I give some feedback to today? Like, it's not something people generally just do easily.
Totally. And it's, I mean, you know, in giving feedback, and you've been on both sides, receiving feedback and giving feedback, and it is very vulnerable to offer your opinion, and you kind of want to be a person who invites feedback and is inviting of feedback, if that makes sense. Like, if I know someone's going to have a flip out or a meltdown, if I say, hey, what's this about? Then I probably won't ever offer feedback again. Like, that's it's just not worth it to me, because they're not willing to hear it, and they're not willing to, I guess, even if I'm completely wrong, and that is a very strong possibility, like, I would hope that I'd have something to offer. And so I sort of treat people in that way as well. And I think it's across the board, like whether it's creative work or just like, you know, give me feedback on what it's like to just be around me? I think that's a good question. Like, there's a question of, what's it like to be on the other side of me? And
yeah,
these are really, I think, when you're inviting feedback into your creative work and your creative process, it's like so vulnerable because that's a version of you. And so, yeah, I think you just have to thick skin, soft heart, I think.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Thick skin, soft heart. Sounds easy, super hard.
Takes practice.
Takes practice, yeah. I love this conversation. I feel like it's even just personally for me, I'm like, there's so many good things and so many good thoughts. And I think that people, I think people are going to appreciate it. I wanted to say thanks for like being so generous with your thoughts and just experience because, yeah, it's like I think about that teacher that you mentioned before in uni that's like, what is the heartbeat of this? Like where's the pulse kind of thing? And then to also be generous like you're being today and share your own kind of story and experiences. I think people are going to find it super helpful and perhaps it'll become like one of those memories for them that point that they go back to. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast today and talking about all these things. And yeah, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
You're welcome, Hannah. It's been a joy.